Berserkers. Unleashed! What fueled their fury?
Okay, let's dive in. Picture this. A warrior, not just fierce, but something else entirely. Howling like a wild animal, eyes blazing, maybe even sinking their teeth into the edge of their shield before charging headlong into chaos.
Right.
Swords and axes bounce off them, fire seems not to touch them. I mean, this is the legendary, terrifying image of the berserker, the source of our modern word berserk. But the big question, the one that fuels this deep dive, is, were these figures of terrifying myth, or were they a visceral, horrifying reality on the battlefield?
That's really the heart of the enigma we're exploring today, isn't it? We're taking a deep dive into the world of these incredible Scandinavian warriors. Often associated with the Viking Age, sure, but their traditions, they actually reach back even further into older Germanic history.
Right.
So to do this, we've gathered a pretty fascinating stack of sources. A comprehensive Wikipedia entry plus articles titled The Enigma of the Berserker, Myth or Reality, and Viking Bare Naked Warriors, a closer look at berserkers.
And our mission is pretty straightforward. We want to cut through the modern myth-making, the caricature, to understand what the actual historical sources and the archaeological evidence might tell us.
Yeah, get past the sort of pop culture image.
Exactly. We want to extract the most important, maybe surprising nuggets of knowledge. We'll unpack the legends, look at the historical clues, grapple with the competing theories about why they entered this terrifying battle frenzy.
The Berserker Gang.
Right, the Berserker Gang, and find out what ultimately happened to them. So you could consider this your essential shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on the whole Berserker phenomenon.
Okay, so where do we start? I mean, tackling the name itself makes sense. Berserker in Old Norse. Understanding the word is kind of the first clue to who these warriors might have been, at least in the minds of the people who name them.
Right.
It's a compound word made up of ber and serker.
Okay, serker means shirt, right? That part seems pretty clear.
Exactly. Serker is shirt. No real debate there. The puzzle, the interesting bit, lies in the first part, berf. Now, the most widely accepted interpretation today, and the one that's strongly supported by our sources, is that bear refers to bear.
Bear, okay.
Which leads to the meaning bear shirt, suggesting a warrior who wears the skin or hide of a bear, maybe as part of their ritual prep, or, even in battle itself. This is the prevailing modern scholarly view.
Bear shirt. That immediately brings the animaton right to the forefront, doesn't it? It sort of makes intuitive sense if they were trying to embody the ferocity of a bear.
It does. It clicks somehow. Now, it's worth noting, because you might have heard it, that the 13th century Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, he offered a different idea.
Okay, what did Snorri think?
Well, writing centuries after the height of the berserker phenomenon, Snorri interpreted bear as bear. B-A-R-E.
Bear shirt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bear shirt. Suggesting they went into battle without armor, maybe bare-chested under just a light garment.
Going into battle bare-chested. That sounds incredibly vulnerable, almost impossibly brave, or maybe just foolish. Was there much evidence for that interpretation?
Well, our sources indicate that Snorri's bear shirt idea is largely abandoned by modern scholars. The textual support for the bear shirt interpretation, linking them to the bear cult and wearing skins, is just considered much stronger overall.
I see.
So while that image of a bare-chested warrior is powerful, the name itself most likely points straight to the bear connection.
Okay, bear shirt warrior it is.
Yeah.
Now, what were they like? The sagas, they're just full of descriptions. What are the consistent traits that keep coming up?
Oh, the sagas portray them vividly. They're described as Scandinavian warriors fighting in this state of trance-like fury, which, as we said, is known as Berserker Gang.
Right.
And this battle frenzy was incredibly intense. Characteristics repeatedly mentioned include howling like wild animals. Snorri Sturluson specifically compared them to hounds or wolves.
Howling?
Foaming at the mouth, and a detail that always sticks with me, gnawing or begging the rims of their shields.
Biting the shield. That's such a specific, almost terrifyingly primal image. It speaks to an extreme loss of control, maybe, or perhaps a ritualized act of intimidation.
Exactly. It's so evocative. And during this state, a crucial belief surrounded them. They were said to be immune to steel and fire.
Wait, immune to swords, to fire?
That's what the stories claim. Swords wouldn't cut them, flames wouldn't burn them. This perceived invincibility meant they could wreak great havoc among the enemy ranks, breaking formations that maybe normal warriors couldn't touch.
Immune to steel and fire. That sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel. Seriously.
It really does, and that's part of the enigma, isn't it? But the sagas state it repeatedly. What's key, though, is that this state wasn't permanent. Our sources describe a very distinct aftermath to the Berserker gang.
Okay, what happened afterwards?
When the frenzy finally subsided, they would become weak, sort of tame, and enter this state of extreme exhaustion and vulnerability. Sometimes experiencing physical symptoms like shivering or even fever.
Wow.
It was like a powerful temporary transformation, but it came with a significant physical cost.
A sudden crash after that incredible peak of fury. That makes them seem almost like a force of nature, but one that burns itself out really quickly. What was their role in society or warfare beyond just being these terrifying fighters?
Well, their very appearance and behavior were, in themselves, a potent psychological weapon. Just the sight of these howling, shield-biting figures, seemingly impervious to damage, that would likely strike terror into any opponent. Imagine standing across a battlefield from that.
I can't even imagine. It would be utterly demoralizing, surely.
Absolutely. Beyond the psychological aspect, though, they seem to have been used strategically. The sources mentioned their potential role as shock troops.
Shock troops, like the first wave.
Yeah, used for their initial furious charge to break enemy lines. They also served as elite bodyguards for kings. Peter Pence, from the National Museum of Denmark, describes them, if we trust the written sources, as the Viking equivalent of special forces.
Viking special forces. Okay, that gives you a real sense of their potential status and military importance. Did this view of them as elite warriors stay consistent over time?
This is where the sources reveal a really interesting shift. Initially, the earlier sagas, they're often portrayed quite positively as loyal bodyguards, formidable champions, elite soldiers, really respected figures.
Right.
However, over time, particularly as Christianity spread and views of, pagan fury changed, their portrayal darkened quite a bit. Later sagas sometimes depict them negatively, as unruly boasters, ravenous looters, or just indiscriminately violent killers, less heroic, definitely more monstrous.
That transformation and portrayal, it likely reflects changing societal values, doesn't it? And the new religious lens, maybe, through which these older traditions were being viewed?
Absolutely. By Christian interpreters, that uncontrolled pagan fury of the Berserker was often seen as something demonic, the work of a heathen devil.
Okay, so we have the legendary description. Bear-linked, howling, shield-biting, seemingly immune to steel and fire, but with this vulnerable aftermath. We also see their complex role in society, shifting from elite to, eventually, outlawed. But were these just stories? Is there anything tangible that hints at their reality beyond the written word?
This is where the archaeological and visual evidence becomes really crucial. It helps us try to bridge that gap between the wild saga descriptions and something concrete from history. A really compelling example is the Lewis chessmen.
Oh, the Lewis chessmen, those beautiful carved pieces.
Exactly, a collection of 12th century chess pieces found in Scotland, thought to be Norse origin. Several of the rook pieces, the castle pieces, depict warriors biting the tops of their shields.
Shield biting again. So that wasn't just some writer's fancy description. It was a recognized visual trait associated with these warriors, even in the 12th century.
Precisely. It strongly suggests this was known practice, or at least a recognized depiction, solidifying the idea that aspects of the saga descriptions weren't purely mythical invention. And speaking of tangible links, this tradition appears to be much, much older than the Viking Age itself. Some scholars propose this whole northern warrior tradition might have originated from ancient hunting magic and animistic beliefs.
Hunting magic, like drawing power from animals, is that the idea?
Exactly that. The theory is that early warrior traditions became deeply linked to specific animal cults. Warriors sought to embody the strength or the ferocity or maybe the protective spirit of certain animals. Our sources point to three main animal cults that seem to have been central: the cult of the bear, the wolf, and the wild boar.
And we see hints of these connections in really early artifacts way before the Vikings.
Yes, well before the main Viking Age. Think about the bas-relief carvings on Trajan's column in Rome, completed in 113 AD.
Wow, that early.
Yeah. These depict the Roman conquest of Dacia. Among the Germanic auxiliary troops and tribal warriors shown, some are depicted barefoot and bare-chested.
And what's significant about those specific depictions? Is it just the lack of armor?
Well, scene 36 on the column is key. It shows these warriors, and strikingly, some are wearing animal head coverings or hoods, specifically bear hoods and wolf hoods.
Bear hoods and wolf hoods. In 113 AD.
Yes. This is a potential visual record from the early 2nd century AD of warriors embodying or wearing bear and wolf forms, apparently fighting together. That's centuries before sagas describe similar warrior groups fighting for Harold Fairhair at the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 872 AD.
That pushes the tradition back nearly 800 years. So it wasn't just a Viking thing, it was a deep-seated Germanic tradition. That's amazing.
It strongly suggests that, yeah. And other early examples support this. The golden horns of Galahus from the early 5th century in Denmark.
Right, those incredible gold horns.
They feature depictions of two animal-headed men facing each other, armed, which some interpret as being related to these early warrior cults.
More visual hints on really significant objects.
Exactly. And then there are the Torslunda plates from the Vendel era in Sweden around the early 7th century. These cast bronze dies, they were used for making helmet decorations, and they're incredibly important.
What do they show?
One plate appears to show what looks like a berserker ritual. Another shows an animal-headed warrior standing next to a one-eyed figure.
One-eyed. Odin.
Widely interpreted as Odin, yeah.
That's a direct visual link between these animalistic warriors, a potential ritual, and the chief Norse god, Odin. That seems incredibly significant for understanding their religious or spiritual dimension.
It really is. It ties the warrior frenzy directly into the pagan belief system.
Yeah.
Another artifact, the Gutenstein scabbard, a silver sword scabbard from a 7th century Germanic grave in Germany, features a warrior figure with a wolf's head.
A wolf's head on a scabbard.
Yeah, this is thought to depict an Ulfhednar, a wolf warrior, and again suggests these traditions were shared across a wide area of pre-Christian Central Europe, not just Scandinavia.
Okay, so from Roman depictions to Scandinavian horns and plates to German scabbards, we're seeing consistent imagery of animal-headed or animal-associated warriors over many centuries and across a broad geographic area.
It's really compelling evidence that the concept existed and was culturally significant long before the sagas were ever written down. These early artistic depictions seem to be the visual precursors to the later saga descriptions of warriors embodying or wearing animal forms, drawing power from them, and associating with deities like Odin.
That makes the later saga accounts feel less like pure fiction and maybe more like the continuation of a very old, very deep tradition. Okay, let's delve into those specific animal associations you mentioned. Bear, wolf, and boar.
Right, so first, the berserkers themselves, strongly linked to the bear. This connects them to the widespread bear cult across the Northern Hemisphere, where the bear was revered for its strength, its ferocity, and that seemingly mystical ability to die in winter hibernation and reawaken in spring.
So the idea is they believed they drew their power directly from the spirit or the essence of the bear.
That's the core theory. They were devoted to the bear cult. The sources give us examples reinforcing this. The bodies of dead berserkers were sometimes ritually laid out in bearskins before the funeral rites.
Interesting.
And the Svarfdela saga tells of a berserker postponing a duel, a single combat challenge, until 3 days after Yule, which suggests they observed religious customs despite their wildness, hinting at a sacred dimension to their state.
That detail about postponing the duel is fascinating. It shows they weren't just randomly violent all the time. There was structure and perhaps ritual even to their challenges.
It does suggest that. And Peter Pence notes a fascinating, if perhaps symbolic, modern echo. The bearskin caps worn by the guards of the Danish monarchs today might just be a distant survival of this ancient bear warrior symbolism.
Wow, a direct line, possibly, from ancient berserkers to modern royal guards. That's wild.
It's a compelling thought, isn't it? The sources also discuss the related concept of hamramni, H-A-M-R-A-M-M-R, which translates roughly as shape strong.
Shape strong.
Yeah. This word can mean the ability to literally shapeshift into an animal form, like a bear. But it also describes entering a state of wild, animalistic fury hemesque. It's like changing your form into a state of pure rage.
So hammer could mean either physical shape-shifting or a kind of mental or spiritual transformation into a furious state. That's complex.
Yes, it seems to encompass both ideas. Eagle's saga describes Skallagrim's men as the hardest of men, with a touch of the uncanny about a number of them, and shaped more like trolls than human beings. Now, while there's no big consensus, this has sometimes been interpreted as them being hammer, possessing this shape-strong quality.
A bit ambiguous there, maybe. Is there a clear example of the actual shape-shifting idea in the sagas?
Oh, yes. A much clearer example comes in the saga of Hrolf Kraki. The berserker Bodvar Bjarki is described as explicitly shape-shifting into a great bear during battle.
Into a bear? Really?
The saga says, and I quote roughly, "Men saw that a great bear went before King Hrolf's men, keeping always near the king. He slew more men with his forepaws than any 5 of the king's champions." That's a powerful pretty unequivocal description of a berserker taking animal form in combat.
That's incredible. A bear warrior who literally becomes a bear in battle.
Okay, so if berserkers were the bear warriors, who were the Ulfhednar, you mentioned them.
Right. The Ulfhednar are the wolf warriors. Ulfhedar. They are frequently mentioned alongside berserkers in the sagas. Their name means wolf-skinned warriors, and they are described as wearing the pelt of a wolf, sometimes over their armor, when they went into battle.
Wolf-skinned.
Yep. Sagas like Vansdale Saga and Haraldssveiði portray them as an elite group, particularly associated with King Harald Fairhair's following.
Another elite unit in the king's retinue linked to animals.
That seems like a pattern.
Yes, often presented as a distinct but related group to the berserkers. The description from Haraldssveiði is very vivid. Wolf-skinned, they are called. In battle, they bear bloody shields. The poem also refers to the raven as a paster of blood, a common kenning, connecting these warriors to the grim reality of battle and death.
And like the berserkers, were the Ulfhednar also linked to Odin?
Yes, absolutely. The Ulfhednar are sometimes specifically described as Odin's special warriors. Snorri Sturluson's description of Odin's men in Gungunga Saga seems to encompass both berserkers and Ulfhednar. He says, Odin's men went without their mail coats and were mad as hounds or wolves bit their shields. They slew men, but neither fire nor iron had effect upon them. This is called going berserk.
Mad as hounds or wolves. That's a pretty clear nod to the wolf warriors, isn't it?
It is. So Odin, as the patron god of these frenzied, animalistic fighters, seems quite central. And that Torslunda plate showing the wolf-headed figure next to Odin makes even more sense in that context.
It absolutely reinforces that connection.
Oh, now, there's maybe a subtle distinction in the sources between being an Ulfean, a wolf-skinned warrior fighting in wolf-like fury, and someone who might actually shapeshift into a wolf. Kveldulf, in Egil's saga, for instance, is described as a berserker who transformed into a wolf at night. That's presented a bit differently from the Ulfhednar fighting in wolf pelts.
Okay, so wolf warriors versus actual wolf shapeshifters, a bit of a nuance there within the animal connections. Interesting. We've covered bears and wolves. What about the third proposed animal type, the wild boar?
Right, the boar. This is perhaps the least explicit in terms of having a dedicated warrior-type name like Berserker or Ulfhedin, but the connection to the boar is really strong in Germanic and Norse culture generally.
How so?
Well, in Norse poetry, the word Jamur, Jofurr, which originally meant wild boar, actually evolves to be used metaphorically for a prince, monarch, or warrior.
How does a word for a wild pig become a word for a king or warrior? That seems like a leap.
It probably stems from the significant role of swine in Germanic paganism, and specifically the custom of wearing boar's heads or boar-crested helmets in battle. Swine were strongly associated with the Vanir deities, Freyr and Freya, who were important gods linked to fertility, prosperity, but also aspects of warfare.
Ah, okay. So wearing boar imagery connects you to these powerful deities for protection or maybe strength in battle.
That's the theory, yeah. Similar to the belief that berserkers drew power from the bear, it's theorized that warriors could ritually transform into boars or at least embody their characteristics like ferocity and toughness to gain strength, bravery, and protection in battle. And this transformation could be symbolized or maybe facilitated by wearing boar helmets as a kind of ritual costume.
And like the bear and wolf connections, we have visual evidence for the boar helmets as well, going back centuries, right? You mentioned those plates.
Exactly. The depictions of warriors with prominent boar-crested helmets on the Torslunda plates and also on the Gundestrup cauldron provide really strong visual support for this theory. It shows that boar imagery was highly significant in warrior identity and gear long before the Viking Age proper.
So it seems likely that these three animal cults, bear, wolf, and boar, were deeply intertwined with distinct yet probably related warrior traditions. The bear-linked berserkers, the wolf-skinned Ulfhednar, and perhaps these boar warriors reflected in terms like jigfur and the visual iconography. It paints a picture of a warrior culture that was deeply spiritual, drawing power and identity from the wild world around them.
It certainly suggests that their fury wasn't just random madness, but potentially rooted in ancient, sacred traditions and beliefs about connecting with animal spirits. Now, having looked at the legends and the ancient roots, maybe we should examine the more direct historical records and try to understand the Berserker gang itself. How is that rage actually described in the sources?
Yeah, good idea. We know they appear in sagas and poems, but how detailed are those descriptions of the actual frenzy?
One of our sources provides a particularly detailed account, and it notes that the Berserker gang wasn't just limited to the battlefield. It could apparently even manifest during strenuous work. Men seized by it would perform feats seemingly impossible for normal human strength.
Wow.
The description outlines the process. It's said to begin with physical signs like shivering, chattering teeth, and a feeling of chill all over the body.
Shivering and a chill before the fury. That's not what I'd expect at all. Seems backwards.
Right. It's quite counterintuitive, isn't it?
Mhm.
Then the face would swell and change color, followed by what's described as a great hot-headedness. This would then climax in the Great Rage, where they howled like wild animals, bit the edge of their shields, and just cut down everything in their path indiscriminately. Friend or foe, apparently.
That indiscriminate violence is chilling. It sounds like a complete loss of control, not like a disciplined soldier at all.
That's how it's often described, yeah. And description highlights the aftermath very clearly. When the state ceased, it was followed by a great dulling of the mind and feebleness, lasting for a day or even more.
That period of exhaustion sounds almost like a total physical and mental collapse.
It really does. And intertwined with this state was that belief in their extraordinary resilience. Snorri's assertion that neither fire nor iron told upon them is, as our sources emphasize, a recurring motif. Sagas repeatedly state that edged weapons and fire just had no effect on berserkers while they were in that state.
So swords and flames didn't hurt them. Was there anything that could injure them according to the sources? Any weakness?
Yes. Crucially, the sources note they were not immune to blunt instruments, like clubs or hammers. That vulnerability is a key detail that separates it from complete magical invincibility.
That's a fascinating loophole in their supposed immunity. Is there a vivid example of this vulnerability to blunt force in the sagas?
Saxo Grammaticus, in his History of the Danes, gives us a really memorable one with the warrior Hardbeen. He describes Hardbeen in a frenzy. Furiously bit and devoured the edges of his shield, he kept gulping down fiery coals. He snatched live embers in his mouth and let them pass down into his entrails.
Gulping coals. Snatching embers.
Wild stuff. Before attacking. Yet Hardbeen is defeated not by a sword, but by King Halfdan, who crushes him with a hammer of wondrous size. And Saxo himself expresses uncertainty about the cause of the frenzy, noting, "It is doubtful whether this madness came from thirst for battle or natural ferocity."
So even someone writing closer to the time was kind of bewildered by the source of the fury, but the account reinforces that vulnerability to blunt trauma. Interesting. The idea of blunting blades with spells or an evil glance was also mentioned. That sounds more magical.
Yes, that motif also appears sometimes, connecting them to magical abilities or maybe a kind of malevolent power. Our sources compare this to tricks attributed to fakirs and note similar ideas appearing very early in Germanic literature, like with the monster Grendel and Beowulf.
Right, linking them to monstrous or supernatural figures. Beyond the legends and the magic, we know kings use them. What was their actual military standing?
Well, their role as shock troops, designed to break enemy lines with their terrifying initial assault, is consistently mentioned. Their rank could be quite high, sometimes equivalent to a royal bodyguard, reinforcing the idea that they were a valued, albeit perhaps volatile military asset to Scandinavian kings like Harald Fairhair.
Given the wild descriptions and all the talk of immunity, how certain can we be that this was always a literal state and not just a fearsome reputation that some warriors adopted?
That's a really important point raised by the sources. It's certainly possible that some warriors simply adopted the name or the ritualistic aspects of Berserk Meterbunda, these male associations or war bands. They might have cultivated the terrifying reputation as a deterrent, a psychological edge, without necessarily entering the full described state of Berserker gang.
So some might have been sort of performing the role, playing the part, while others might have genuinely experienced this extreme state. Which leads us right to the central puzzle, doesn't it? The deepest part of the enigma, what caused the Berserker gang. This is where the scientific and psychological theories really try to make sense of those descriptions.
Exactly. The enduring debate boils down to trying to find some kind of rational explanation for this described fury and resilience. It's just so extreme.
Let's start with the popular idea substances. Was it drugs? Mushrooms, maybe?
That's a long-standing theory for sure. One of the most speculated substances is the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria. Our sources mention that these mushrooms are common in Scandinavia, and they are known psychoactives.
So the idea is they ate the mushrooms to go into a frenzy.
That's the hypothesis, yeah. It was proposed way back in the 18th century. However, the sources also present another plant theory that's been gaining some traction. Black henbane, Hyoscyamus niger.
Henbane, what does that do?
Well, henbane is known to induce delirium, aggression, and crucially, a reduced sensitivity to pain symptoms that actually align quite well with the descriptions of the berserker state.
That sounds closer, maybe. Is there any concrete evidence linking henbane to the Vikings, not just speculation?
Yes, there's some intriguing archaeological evidence. Henbane seeds were discovered in a Viking grave dug up in 1977 near Furkat in Denmark.
Wow, seeds in a grave.
Yeah. This find, combined with the known pharmacological effects of henbane matching the berserker symptoms, lends some actual support to its potential use to induce that warlike state.
Finding the seeds in a grave definitely adds weight to the henbane theory compared to just speculation about fly agaric, doesn't it? But are these drug theories widely accepted now?
Not universally, no. Our sources highlight some significant critiques. A major argument is that many of these substances, including fly agaric, often cause side effects like nausea, lethargy, confusion, or disorientation, which would seem pretty counterproductive for effective fighting, right?
Yeah, you don't want your shock troops feeling sick or wandering around confused.
Exactly. As Peter Pence puts it, the mushroom theory, specifically, is now considered basically a myth among many experts.
Okay. So while henbane has some evidence, the drug explanation overall isn't exactly a slam dunk.
Far from it. There's also been speculation about massive amounts of alcohol, though again, extreme drunkenness usually impairs fighting ability quite badly, or some mysterious mixture called butotens, but the evidence for those is really weak.
Okay, so if not substances, or at least not just substances, could it have been purely psychological? Could they somehow induce this state mentally?
This is a really powerful alternative line of reasoning. The idea is that the Berserker gang was a form of self-induced hysteria, or maybe a trance state.
How would that work?
Well, it could potentially be achieved through intense ritual preparation, maybe chanting, drumming, perhaps hyperventilation, and extreme psychological conditioning designed to push the mind and body to a state of, well, ecstatic rage.
So they literally whip themselves into a frenzy through ritual and mental focus, like autosuggestion.
That's the concept, a form of autosuggestion, or self-induced ecstatic rage, as Peter Pence describes it. And crucially, we shouldn't forget the psychological impact on their enemies. The sheer terror they inspired would have been a powerful enhancer of their effectiveness, regardless of the internal cause.
Fear as a force multiplier. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense on its own. What other psychological factors could be at play here?
Well, think about the combination of intense adrenaline surges during combat, combined with potentially deep, unwavering faith, perhaps in Odin as their patron god. That could create an extreme state.
How so?
It could lead to things like tunnel vision, temporary pain suppression, and a form of disassociation from physical discomfort. Your mind is just so focused or so outside the immediate sensation of pain that you can ignore injuries that would normally stop someone cold.
Disassociating from the sheer brutality of combat just to keep fighting? That sounds like a survival mechanism we sometimes see even today in extreme situations. And speaking of modern connections, you mentioned a possible link to PTSD.
This is perhaps one of the most compelling and, frankly, quite sobering modern interpretations. Some scholars see definite parallels between the descriptions of the Berserker gang and aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder. Jonathan Shea, in his work Achilles in Vietnam, draws an explicit connection.
Between ancient Berserker rage and modern PTSD, how?
He connects it to the symptoms of hyperarousal, emotional deadness after the event, and the explosive rage observed in combat veterans with PTSD.
That's a powerful and perhaps pretty uncomfortable parallel. He sees the Berserker state as potentially a form of ancient combat trauma response.
He does. Our sources quote Shea, stating that surviving the Berserk state imparts emotional deadness and vulnerability to explosive rage and permanent hyperarousal, hallmarks of post-traumatic stress disorder. He feels his clinical experience supports placing this state right at the root of severe psychological injuries in veterans.
Wow. That puts a very different spin on the heroic or just fearsome image, doesn't it? It suggests the frenzy might not have been a sustainable power source at all, but something deeply damaging to the individual in the long run.
It complicates the picture significantly, yeah. It wasn't just a switch they could flip on and off without consequence, potentially. Another psychological perspective simply suggests that maybe a berserker was just a warrior who didn't fight against the chaos of battle, but fully embraced it, finding a unique kind of strength right there at the brink of madness.
Leaning into the maelstrom, so to speak. And Peter Pence offered one more idea, linking it back to rituals.
Yes, Pence suggests the whole berserker idea might have originally been part of an initiation ritual for young warriors entering a warband or society. If this were the case, elements like maybe nakedness or going bare-chested might make more sense as part of a ceremonial transition rather than standard battle attire. which kind of loops back to Snorri's bare shirt idea, but in a different context.
So the theories really range widely, from specific plants like henbane to intense psychological conditioning, possibly even a trauma response or an initiation rite. It's clear the precise cause remains heavily debated, and perhaps it was a combination of factors, really.
Very likely. I mean, it's that combination of mystery, terrifying description, and potential real-world explanation that makes them so enduringly fascinating, isn't it?
Absolutely. Regardless of the cause of the frenzy, though, we know that the era of the Berserkers eventually came to an end. What happened to them historically? How did they fade out?
Well, first, let's just reiterate that immediate aftermath we talked about.
Yeah.
After the Berserker gang subsided, the sagas are clear about the difficult state they were left in: extreme exhaustion, weakness, vulnerability, sometimes shivering, or fever.
So they were incredibly powerful temporarily, but then paid a heavy physical price afterwards.
Yes. And their erratic behavior in general likely made them difficult to control or, integrate into society during peacetime. While invaluable and terrifying in battle, they were probably feared or even ostracized, otherwise a necessary but dangerous tool, as one source aptly puts it.
Yeah, not exactly the kind of people you'd want hanging around the village square when there wasn't a battle to fight, I imagine.
Precisely. And this inherent difficulty likely contributed to their decline, alongside major societal shifts. A significant factor was that they were eventually outlawed. Jarl Eirikr Håkonarson outlawed berserkers in Norway in 1015.
Outlawed them completely?
Yep. And the medieval Icelandic law code, the Gragas, also specifically sentenced berserker warriors to outlawry, basically banning them from society. By the 12th century, organized berserker warbands seem to have largely disappeared from the historical records.
Outlawed by the authorities, that's a clear legal move to suppress them. What role did the major cultural shift of Christianity play in all this?
Oh, the rise of Christianity was absolutely pivotal. The uncontrolled, pagan fury of the berserker fundamentally clashed with Christian ideals of control, order, and, non-pagan worship.
Right.
Their power, so deeply linked to Odin and animal spirits, was seen as too primal, too pagan, even potentially demonic from the new perspective. This new religious and social order actively sought to suppress them, leading to their disappearance from historical accounts as acceptable or integrated figures in society.
So it was a legal and a religious suppression working together. Did the very idea of what it meant to be a warrior change as well around that time?
That's a good point. Peter Pence points out that the warrior ethos itself evolved. The older idea was strongly tied to cult, to ritual, to figures like Odin. As society changed, the warrior ideal moved towards more organized, maybe professional soldiers, similar to those emerging in contemporary European societies. The Berserker, with their deep pre-Viking Age cult-linked origins, were really a part of that older world that was fading away.
That makes sense. As structured armies and Christian morality became dominant, the individualistic, fiercely pagan berserker would become obsolete or just simply unacceptable. It's interesting, though, that despite sometimes fighting without armor, the sagas mention that injuries weren't always seen negatively.
Yes, our sources note that. Scars and injuries sustained in battle, even defects that might have come from fighting without armor, were often regarded with respect in Viking society. They weren't necessarily looked down upon as weakness.
That's kind of counterintuitive from a modern perspective.
Yeah.
Why was that?
Well, the sources point to examples from the gods themselves. Tyr, the god of war and justice, lost his hand. Odin famously lost an eye. Heimdall lost an ear. Yet their power and abilities weren't seen as diminished because of it. This reflects an admiration in Viking culture for resilience, for overcoming physical limits, and for the marks of having faced and survived intense conflict. It ties right into the heroic ideal.
Scars as a badge of honor, showing you've truly faced the fire and the iron, maybe. Before we wrap up, what about berserker brides? That's a really intriguing, if mysterious, term mentioned in the sources.
It is intriguing, isn't it? And importantly, our sources emphasize the uncertainty around this term. It pops up in some medieval texts, but its meaning is heavily debated. It could possibly refer to actual female berserkers, or perhaps to giantesses from Norse mythology. The evidence for actual female berserkers is very, very tenuous.
Female berserkers. Wow, that would be an incredible addition to the picture if it were confirmed, wouldn't it?
It certainly would, but it remains highly speculative based on the current evidence. What is clear, however, is that Viking women shared the cultural admiration for military arts with the men. This is evident in their adornment.
How so?
Viking women commonly wore pieces of actual weaponry, military gear, jewelry designed to imitate weapons, and even battle trophies like reworked fittings from looted Irish or English items as personal adornment. Brooches shaped like axes, things like that.
So the appreciation for military prowess and the connection to warfare was pervasive in Viking society, maybe across genders, even if women weren't typically frontline fighters.
Absolutely. The sources suggest that wearing miniature weapons might have offered symbolic protection, and broadly, this military jewelry reflected the core ideals of Viking society, where strength and success in conflict were highly valued by everyone.
It seems the spirit of the warrior, even the extreme form embodied by the Berserker, permeated the entire culture in really fascinating ways.
It really did.
Yeah.
Ultimately, as Peter Pence reminds us, much of what we know about berserkers is based on saga literature written down centuries later, often filtered through different perspectives and agendas, particularly after the conversion to Christianity. So yeah, it's tenuous in parts, but the traces in artifacts and depictions, like those potential dancing warriors and bears at the National Museum of Denmark, they do hint at a reality behind the legends.
And of course, the most direct legacy is the word berserk itself, right here in modern English.
A direct linguistic inheritance, exactly. And as our sources highlight, their image endures powerfully in popular culture, from Tolkien and The Witcher to major video game franchises like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Marvel Comics with Thor, and recent films like The Northman. They're everywhere.
They really are.
The sources even speculate that the wild, transforming nature of their fury might have contributed, maybe just a little, to the much later legends of the werewolf.
Interesting connection. So whether viewed through the lens of history, psychology, or mythology, the figure of the Berserker just continues to capture our imagination.
A truly enduring enigma, for sure.
Okay, let's try and bring this deep dive together then. We've peeled back quite a few layers of the Berserker enigma, haven't we? From the etymology linking them to bears, through those wild saga descriptions of their fury and perceived immunity, to the ancient roots in animal cults shown in centuries of artifacts. And we've debated the compelling yet still uncertain theories about what fueled their rage, from speculative substances like henbane to intense psychological states, trance, perhaps even something akin to a trauma response.
Right. The precise nature of the Berserker gang remains a subject of active scholarly debate, absolutely. But the evidence, even filtered through time and later interpretations, strongly suggests they were a real and frankly terrifying phenomenon in Viking and earlier Germanic warfare. Even if the literal invincibility was, exaggeration or mythologizing.
Yeah. And whether that fury was driven by drugs or ritual or psychological conditioning or pathological states or some mix we don't fully understand, they certainly embodied an extreme form of human intensity and raw, unbridled fury in conflict. They were a chilling, fascinating part of history that really pushes the boundaries of what we think is possible for humans.
They definitely force us to confront the extremes of human behavior, especially under stress and in combat situations.
So what does this deep dive into the Berserker phenomenon leave you thinking about? What new perspective do you gain on, say, human limits, or the psychology of warfare, the power of belief and ritual, or just that constant fascinating tension between myth and reality when we look at historical accounts? There's a lot to ponder there, I think.
There really is. And building on those psychological theories and the modern connections like PTSD, here's maybe a final thought to leave you with. Given the intense psychological and physiological states described in our sources, could modern soldiers in the most extreme combat situations today ever approach a state that's similar in some ways to the ancient Berserker gang? What does understanding this ancient fury reveal about the enduring nature of human aggression, resilience, and perhaps the potential psychological cost of conflict? Right across the